Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm not going to do what you think I'm going to do, which is to stand up here and go through a whole bunch of slides. I actually don't care if I don't use any of them. So if I say anything that you want to talk about, stop me, please. And to encourage that, I'd like to ask you all to help me in some research that I've been doing for quite some time now. I've done this in front of groups of thousands of people. I've done this, I find that it doesn't work if the group is below a certain size, but I don't want to overly influence your actions. So if you would just indulge me for a minute and then I'll explain it. I'm going to put my hand up, and when I do, I'd like everyone to clap one single time, and I apologize to the gentleman with the headphones on his ears. So when you see me put my hand up, please clap exactly one time. Okay, I'm going to do it one more time. Now that we're all warmed up, when I put my hand up, clap please exactly one time. Okay. Now, this time I'd like you to clap exactly 3 times. Okay, there's always an overachiever. What did you notice? And pretty good, right? Mm-hmm. The second clap, my recollection, was spot on, and even the third one, somebody clapped once, but then all the rest of the claps were all in sync. That's what you heard, right? Now, ironically, we're recording this. If you watched the recording, you'd be amazed at how out of sync it really was in real life. So this amazing, neural network that we're born with between our ears organizes the world around us and finds patterns sometimes where they don't exist. And I know you all know this. It's a fascinating thing to see this happen. I didn't say, please clap exactly 3 times. I didn't give you any sense of cadence. You made up the cadence yourself and tell you how loud to clap. Everybody more or less approximated everyone's clapping volume, right? All of these things are going on. Somehow, all of this data around you is being processed in ways that we don't completely understand, and we just deal with it, and it's life, right? Well, this is starting to happen in our systems now. No one in this room, I don't know how many people are in here, 40, 50 people, no one in this room is thinking about how their shoes feel. Now you're all thinking about how your shoes feel. Now some of you are trying not to think about how your shoes feel. And we don't get that. Well, how do we build a system that discovers new types of data that are available to the enterprise and decides whether or not they're valuable without having to bring them in first and vet them, which is the way we've done it traditionally? We can't do that anymore. Information is being created at an arguably hypergeometric rate, an exponent of an exponent, right? We don't have time to look at every single thing and say, is this valuable or not? Am I going to need this in the future? Do I understand it? Is it true? Is it fraudulent? All of those things. Why do people ask rhetorical questions? These are all part of the dialogue that needs to go on, but now it needs to happen in, a 100th of a second or a 1,000th of a second. And somehow information that wasn't relevant a day ago or a month ago can become relevant, just like you've forgotten how your shoes feel until I just mentioned it again. It's like a little party trick, right? So I am the chief data scientist at Dun & Bradstreet. Dun & Bradstreet has arguably the largest commercial database in the world. I say arguably because it depends on how you define commercial, it depends on how you define database, here we go, whatever. But you get the idea. It's very big, very dynamic, coming from 230 or so different countries, depending on how you define a country. It's updated millions of times a day in different languages and different writing systems. Those countries have different laws, and all of that has to come together, and at the same time we have to figure out when there's new sources of data that might be useful, and whether or not they're valuable, and whether or not they're true, and there's hundreds or thousands of times a day that people try to lie to us. We know this, we catch them, those kinds of things are going on. There are data sovereignty laws all over the world that are changing constantly. I work with some of those lawmakers to help them understand the implications to their mission in their country and what they're trying to do versus what they're likely to do if they pass the law the way they've written it. Did I say that out loud? Yeah. I hate it when my inside voice talks. So we have to be really, really careful that we're good stewards of data in this world. We say data a lot, data, data, data. And it's very easy to say, I'm looking at the D&B database. There's hundreds of D&B databases. The reality is you're looking at a publication of a piece of that database. And if we can't make it make sense in the context of all of those other highly dynamic things that are going on in a way that's relevant to the ultimate consumer of that in the context of a problem, then we got a problem, right? I have this conversation all the time with very senior people in very large organizations. You're a powerful person. how many countries are you in? Oh, we're in, 43 countries. Can you tell me exactly how many employees are in your company? Well, certainly. Well, we've got, and then they sort of look at the phone, hoping that somehow they're going to, and then they realize there's no one they can call because they're sleeping in one, and eventually you get no. It's a knowable number and yet an undiscoverable number. So there's also these inconvenient truths about highly dynamic data that is being curated, that it's kind of never all true, and yet we treat it as if it is all true. So we have this sense of the sensitivity of the answer and whether or not that matters. All right, so with all of that in mind, I'm going to show you a very brief video. I'd like to ask you to indulge me to watch this video and keep these 3 guiding questions in mind, because if we're going to be true scholar practitioners, we should always have guiding questions, right? So the guiding questions here is, how is the data landscape changing? And what are we doing in data science to respond? That one is more rhetorical right now. I'll try to answer that in the rest of this presentation. And what type of skills and thinking are required to stay relevant in a world that's changing as fast as the world around us? So think about all of that, please, while you watch this commercial from the fine folks at Adobe.
Peter, come take a look at this.
Look at this.
What's this? The numbers, they keep getting bigger and bigger.
The clicks are off the charts.
Yeah.
Yoshi, it's Walter. We're back. Take a look at Woodpole. Everything you got at Woodpole right now.
She really loves that thing.
It's funny, but it's sadly close to the truth, right? There are a massive amount of anecdotal correlations going on right now with data because it's available. We can see it, and we say, well, therefore it must mean blah. And there's no test to say, well, what would have to be true if our assumptions are true, right? We kind of forget about this whole scientific method that we observe something, and then we look at what's been studied before, and then we construct a methodology. We defend that as the best methodology. We go out and we collect the data, we test the data, we prove or disprove all that's out the window. It's like the clicks are off the charts, the numbers, they're getting bigger and bigger. I love I'll get you more trees. I love that guy. Like there's so much, but it's funny, but you can sort of see it happening. Some caricature of that happens in business all the time. And we have to be better than this. If we're going to, one of 2 things is going to happen in the age that we're in right now. So I know you all know this, but I'll say in case there's maybe one person in the room somehow didn't know this, the word library, I just love it in Greek, bibliotheki, the place where you keep your books, right? I don't think anybody here thinks that's all that a library is today, right? No. Not so much, right? The library is effectively infinitely large and highly dynamic and very connected to the rest of the world, kind of like the guy going, I'll get you more trees, right? So how do we avoid making these sort of blunders of this is more important than that, that's relevant, this isn't relevant, we need to keep this, we don't need to keep that, nobody's going to care about that. Very, very big questions. And then while you're doing that, more data is being created, and more data is being created, and more data is being created. When I did my dissertation, the first step you do, you sit down and you've got too much information, right? And you got to narrow down to do your literature review. You got to narrow it down, right? So the first step most people do is they say, well, select English only. Well, hold on, just a minute. How do you know that research has only been done in some other language that's relevant to the question that you're asking? Well, I can't read it. And then somebody else, the person on the other side, says, well, just put it through a translator. Well, what kind of transformations of the data are going on when you translate it? So actually, as part of my, if anybody wants to talk about it later, it's pretty cool. I actually studied that as part of the question. How would this question be different if you excluded non-English or if you included non, and it actually turns out you reach a different conclusion, which was a little scary because most people do that first, right? How do we deal with that in a world where we've already passed, way past the point where more than half the information that's being created is not in English and not in the Roman alphabet? And the answer isn't just hit the translate button, because you can't, because the library isn't the place where you keep your books, and that's what the word means, right? And here we go. So these are some statements from credit reports from Dun & Bradstreet. And I do this for a couple reasons. I do this to sort of honor the past, that we've kind of come a long way. The company started before the Civil War. This is slightly after the Civil War. And you see these are real comments from real credit reports, or let's say business information reports. And I've got some words highlighted in red that I'd like to focus on. So this is an entry on J.D. Rockefeller. And it says, you know, blah, 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 blah. It is said and reputed, right? So the author here is trying to be careful to say that this is the whole, I didn't say she took the money. You know, if you emphasize every single word in it, it means 7 different things, right? So write it down, it's really cool. You know, over here we've got purchaser of stolen goods. Now in today's world, if you're going to say something like that, and we do, you better be able to prove it, right? You better be able to prove it, or, you know, as soon as you can say lawsuit, you're going to be talking to that person, the storekeeper in Halifax. I love this one. I think it is safe to trust him. Now, we would never say anything like that today, right? But we would say 8 out of 10. It's the same thing. It's just a number. You just replaced a bunch of words with a number. And I love this one. About to marry a fellow of no account. Therefore, she's not relevant, right? Good luck with that one today. So we would like to believe that we've evolved from this, right? But the reality is, in some ways we haven't, in some ways we haven't. And while we're sort of noodling on this idea of how much did the world really change in terms of forming an opinion, the reason all of this started was there was westward expansion, and you couldn't actually physically go and see the person you were going to do business with, so you had to rely on other people to tell you about them. Well, that's what's going on right now. What do you do when you buy something on eBay? You read the reviews, right? The difference here is that there were people like Abraham Lincoln doing this. There were very, you know, trustworthy, conscientious people who really took this seriously, and now, oops, now we have social media and news and user communities and online ratings, and these things are squishy. And there's second and third order observations in them. There are things like, you know, if I take the sum of all of the ratings, if I take the average rating, you know, you have 3.2 star rating. Nobody gave it a 3.2 star rating, but on average, that's what they got. Well, I think we all know you can't average Likert scales, right? But we do, right? Because you can, because it's a number. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And yet we do. We do a lot of things today, and when I say we, the human race, do a lot of things today that are empirically undefendable because we can, because we have the tools, and because we have the data. And that is not an excuse. So part of the science in data science is being a scientist, actually making sure that you're defending the methods that you're using and being careful about it. And I keep saying that because we all have to think this way, and certainly our kids have to think this way. One of two things is going to happen. We're going to be the point of inflection in the human race where we started to drown on our own data and lost control of it, or the point where we suddenly figured out that we got to do something a little bit smarter. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 general topics here. The new normal, which I've kind of already started, which is I'm trying to point out the ways in which the world around us are changing, even if we're not paying attention, kind of like your shoes. Does anybody here have uncomfortable shoes on, by the way? Because if you do, I'm sorry. The second one is, if we see how the world is reacting, how are we reacting to what we see, right? If we just say, yep, I think that's right. I think I am gaining weight, right? Well, we all know how that ends, right? You can't just watch something and do nothing about it other than watching it. Now, sometimes our interventions don't have the intended effect, but we should at least understand how we're reacting. And then the last one is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the future and where I think it's going, because I do spend a lot of time thinking about this. And I hope that you'll indulge me a little bit. I'll tell you where I think the future of data is going and why I think that matters, that we think about that. So I'm trying to be a bit of a reflective practitioner myself. So there you go. So let's start with the new normal. I call this moonshots and selfies. What the heck is he talking about? Does anybody recognize this? Love this. What is it? Yeah.
It's
the cone of silence. Tell us about the cone of silence.
Oh, well, it was for whenever you had to tell someone, or when you had to tell a top secret, you had to go into the cone of silence.
So this is the chief, right?
Yeah.
And this is Secret Agent 86, Maxwell Smart. And if they're already inside control, right? Inside a very
Sometimes couldn't hear each other. so
right.
they-
The cone of silence worked so well that when they lowered it, they couldn't hear each other. So the irony was that they would like scream and then they couldn't hear each other, and they'd hold up cards with what they were trying to say because the cone of silence worked so well that they couldn't use it to make. Well, we actually have the cone of silence today, right? You know, how many times have you been in a situation where you need to do something and you can't find your password, or the thing won't work, or there's two-factor authentication and it's sent a text message to your other cell phone, or we live in this world right now. We have created the cone of silence, but we didn't see it happening, right? Who's this? Well, it says Neil Armstrong right there, right? Neil Armstrong, I love this, went to the moon. Well, it's a little more than that, right? First guy on the moon. And while Neil Armstrong was on the moon, there were five photographs taken of Neil Armstrong. And one of them was actually a selfie. It was him reflected in Buzz Aldrin's helmet visor. So there were really 4 photos of Neil Armstrong taken while he was on the moon. And she goes to the bathroom and takes 37 selfies in the mirror. Right? So we see our behavior changing, but we're not paying attention to these changes. And it's not hard to go on the internet and find things like this. And I don't know if all of this is true or not. I try to put sources on all this stuff, but it would require. How would you know? How could you possibly test all of this? So we take it as if it's true, and we just accept it must be true. It's on the internet, right? But I look at some of these things. 2.78 million video views in 1 minute on YouTube. I can't really wrap my brain around this, the number of tweets. 1,389 Uber rides in a minute. So watch this. Don't watch your neighbors. I'm going to hand you 10 pennies. Show me how you would reach out to take the 10 pennies. Okay. I'm going to hand you 100 pennies. I'm going to hand you 1,000 pennies. Okay. 10,000 pennies. What do you need to hold 10,000 pennies?
Let me get it back.
Wait, how big a basket? Like a waste basket or like a big laundry basket?
Well, I don't know. I've never really measured.
Okay, so, well, here's the problem. We're at 10 to the 4th right now, and we all fogged out, right? Yep. And we're talking about 10 to the 6th, and 10 to the 7th, and 10 to the 8th here. The reality is we don't know how big these numbers are. We can write them down, but we don't have the ability to conceptualize numbers that are this big. And yet we behave as if we can conceptualize rates of change that are this egregious. We really can't. So the reality is we're already all numb to this. You see numbers like this and you go, yeah, I saw something like that. I saw something like that on Facebook. And well, I tweeted this and I said something like, a lot can happen in 60,000 milliseconds. And I was trying to make a subtle point that I call it 60,000 milliseconds to make it sound longer, right? Realistically, and now I'm thinking, is it 6,000 or 60,000? I think it's 60,000. If I'm wrong, this is recorded for all history, right? The point is, it's just a number until you start to think about how it matters. Now let's think a little bit about how it matters. So there's I can't remember what it's called, but there's a piece of software that you can make available for airplanes, where instead of using the standard weather radar that they have, they basically beam up more situational awareness to the airplane from the ground. So they have like bigger computers on the ground and more inputs to the weather and the situational awareness of the airplane, and they beam up this sort of color, kind of 3D-esque view. It's not really 3D, but the pilot gets a lot more information about the weather in front of the airplane. Seemed like a really good idea. There was about, I don't remember the numbers, but something like a 2-second latency. It takes time to render this graphical image and then send it to the airplane. Well, the airplane is flying at 500 or 600 miles an hour, and it goes pretty far in 2 seconds. And when the plane enters a turbulent zone, there's certain things they have to do to penetrate that turbulent zone, and if they don't know about it until 2 seconds after they should know about it, the whole plane is inside that turbulent zone and it's configured wrong, and really bad things started to happen before somebody realized that 2 seconds is actually a really long time when you're traveling at 500 or 600 miles an hour. So we have to think about this more holistically than we are, and not just put up graphics that say, oh, Google, 2.4 million search queries in it. We have more than 10 billion inquiries in a year against our database. There's 250 million DUNS numbered entities in our database. So if you take 200, or if you take 10 billion, it's more than 10 billion, but if you take 10 billion and 200 million, you've got tens of billions against hundreds of millions, and that gives you the relative order. So you could very easily say, well, therefore I know what the average number of inquiries is. No, you don't, because you don't know what those inquiries are for. Are they for updates? Are they for checking the data? Are they customers? Are they computers talking to other computers? Until you understand more about that number is meaningless. So I was doing a STEM presentation for a bunch of a group that comes into Dun & Bradstreet, and they're all walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket, and they were born with this capability, so they're digital natives, right? And so they're saying, well, you only have an iPhone 5S, what's wrong with you? Like, they're not even thinking about, the implications of how amazing it is to be able to have all this information at their fingertips, and I have to get their attention and try and get them to care about science and pay attention to the inquiry process and understand methods and all of the things that you all studied in school and know intuitively they don't, right? So I Googled how high is the sky? And you get back lyrics to a song, and you get back an article on what the sky looks like from different perspectives, when it turns black and when it's blue. And you got an article about the Gulf of Maine aquarium. I have no idea why. And then there's a Wikipedia article, Everything True Must Be on Wikipedia, that talks about the atmosphere, right? And these are all answers to the question, how high is the sky? And at the same time, none of these are answers to how high is the sky, because it's a stupid question. It's not a stupid question if you're writing poetry. It's not a stupid question if you're sort of waxing poetic about, searching on the internet. But it is a stupid question if you want an empirical answer, meaning that you'll get the same answer again if you ask the same question. And we all know how search engines work. Their primary goal is to deliver advertising, right? And, so think about what you're doing. And I'm not anti-Google. I use it every day. And this isn't just Google, any search engine. But use everything for a reason. Don't use a hammer to hammer in a screw. So I want to tell you a quick story about fires to make my point about big data. And I like this story a lot because a bunch of really smart people were involved. This is not the study. This is just one of several things that are going to come up here, right? I don't want you to think that's the provenance, right? I have to remember who I'm talking to. So the basic story outline is that there was a bunch of people that were involved in creating building codes. And they went to a group of postdocs, and they said, we're going to pay you, we're going to commission you to do a study to prove that stronger building codes produce safer buildings. So what is the problem in the setup of this story? Why do we all know this is a bad way to start? Right. So we have a post hoc conclusion, right? Or a pre-hoc, ad hoc conclusion, right? Before the study, we've concluded what the answer is going to be. I want you to prove that A causes B. What else is wrong?
It's not talking about things like wiring or other aspects of the building.
We haven't defined safe, right? What the group did was they said, and they were good, they said, we'd like to help you, but we may not prove what you want us to prove. We will study the relationship between building codes and safety. But we can't promise you that we will prove that better building codes produce safer buildings because we haven't studied it yet. This is what we do. So is that what you want us to do? Yeah. Because we know you're going to reach that conclusion, right? So they go into a room, and I'm dramatizing this. It's not exactly how it happened. But they basically decided that they took the money for the study and that it's too ambiguous. Like, what does safe mean, right? Mm-hmm. And they start trying to do some progressive decomposition on this question to get to something that they can really study. And they decide that it's too squishy to talk about safe. It's like, how high is the sky? So we need something absolute, like death. Mm-hmm. So we're going to study deaths in buildings versus building codes. We're going to look at where people died in buildings, and we're going to look at the reasons why they died, and some of them will have died because they had a heart attack in a building, and some of them will have died because the ceiling collapsed or the, I don't know, whatever. And then that'll relate to a building code, and then we'll say, all right, certain percentage of these deaths were related to things that are treated by building codes, and then we'll figure out some way to do a sensitivity analysis on stronger building codes, right? Guess what happened? It was a global study too, by the way. Yeah, just because it wasn't hard enough. Guess what happened? And I apologize, I'm moving around a lot. I just got back from India, and if I don't move, I'm going to fall asleep. So,
Well, you got all kinds of geological factors,
okay.
you know.
And some places keep better records than others.
Do you think we're going to get the same level of data in Burkina Faso as we do in New York City?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? And then there's latency, right? When is it published? There's political factors of, do they want to tell you that people are dying in the buildings? There's, you said geological, there's certain places that are just more dangerous, right? So we maybe need stronger building codes for earthquakes in Japan than we do in I don't know, wherever, North Dakota, right? Charlotte. So, there's that. So there's the inherent danger that is absent the building code's implications to it. And on and on and on and on and on. And they're like really in trouble now. And they've taken a lot of money at this point when they reach this conclusion. So, and it's, it's time to meet with the sponsor. And so far, they haven't even defined the question yet, right? So the next thing they did was they said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at deaths by fire. Because most deaths in buildings, and they did some anecdotal observation. They didn't just sort of make this up. They didn't do like a full-on statistical evaluation, but they talked to experts, and they talked to a lot of building code people. Most building codes have to do with either ingress and egress, or they have to do with flammability of materials. There's building codes about electrical, but the electrical ultimately gets to not starting an electrical fire. That it's a reasonable conclusion. It's called a grand. Well, this one isn't the grand simplifying assumption yet, but it's a simplifying assumption. They have reduced the problem to deaths by fire. And they went back to the sponsor and they said, would you be okay with that? And they said, well, and then after a bunch of pontification, they said, yeah, okay. Because they got it, that they need something absolute. So now we're not looking at safety anymore. We're looking at death, and we're looking at death by fire. And they made one more assumption, that you have to die in the building. Because it's a problem, right? If somebody is severely burned in a building and then they're taken to a hospital and they die in the hospital, did they die because they got a nosocomial infection, or did they die because of their burns? And this is not an easy question to answer. So to make this statistically pure, and for the purposes of the study, they said, we're going to look at people that died in the building. Are you okay with that? And I can imagine the sponsor getting more and more nervous, because his world is getting smaller, and he's standing on a postage stamp now, right? But he says, okay. They say, okay, I don't even know who the sponsor was. So then they go back to their lab, and they start looking at lots and lots of data that's available. I love Walls and Ceilings magazine, right? There's studies, there's tons and tons of studies. And it turns out that they still have this fundamental problem that there's more data available in certain parts of the world than others, and data is more freely shared, and the truth is fungible and all that stuff. So eventually they say, the only way we can do this is we're going to do deaths by fire per capita. So we're going to sort of normalize Burkina Faso and the United States, right? We're going to sort of, by doing deaths by fire per capita, we're going to make the small countries and the large countries sort of parity in this study, have parity. But then you still have the problem that there's more data available in the largely developed countries than there is in the largely undeveloped countries. Then they got to the grand simplifying assumption. They said if we look at the capital cities of all countries, they will be among the most densely populated cities. They may not be the most. Washington, D.C. is not as densely populated as New York City, but it's close. So if we look at the capital cities of all countries in the world, and we look at deaths by fire per capita per capital, now we only have like 230 data points. We can put it in a spreadsheet. And we can sort it by any number of parameters that have to do with building codes, and we can reach an empirical, reproducible conclusion that is defendable and transparent. And they pushed the button, and they found the answer. Guess what the safest city in the world is for deaths by fire per capita per capita? And do not say a city that is not a capital city, Because somebody will always go, Dallas, So country capitals. Take a guess. Because I know the answer. I know, but what do you think? Okay, because the U.S. has a lot of building codes, and we understand fire safety. We've got lots of firemen, right? I still don't understand why they call them firemen and not watermen, but we have, right? It's not the United States. Reykjavik, because it's ice. There's ice. Ice doesn't burn, right? It's a good guess. It's not Reykjavik, and no one could spell it anyway, so they. All right. And so we can play this game, right? And somebody eventually says Belize because it rains a lot, and then somebody else says, well, okay, let's go someplace really underdeveloped because maybe they just don't have a lot of big buildings and people can just get out, right? And then they, and you never get it. The answer ultimately is La Paz, Bolivia. Now, before I tell you why it's La Paz, Bolivia, why do you think it's La Paz, Bolivia? Sorry? The altitude. There's no oxygen, right? They call it the fireproof city, right? There's just no oxygen. So they go back to the sponsors and they say, here's what you do. You don't worry about building codes that have to do with ingress and egress. You just take the oxygen out of the building, right? And that's not what they said. They said, if you focus your building codes on the flammability of materials, you are empirically more likely to save lives than if you focus on other aspects of building codes. And here's the study to prove it. And actually, the sponsor was very happy with it. So this is an example of taking a big data problem and refining and refining and refining the question and being very scientific about the answer and being very empirical about the process and reaching a conclusion that can actually save people's lives. So I don't want to be overly melodramatic, but we can do this or we can guess. And when we guess, we kind of know what happens, right? Maybe you get it right, maybe you don't get it right. So I have one last study to share with you. That one was quantitative. And if I want to be a true mixed methods researcher, I should have a qualitative study. So now I'm going to share a qualitative. Thank you for laughing. So if I have are you a research methodologist? Because you're, okay. Because there's a lot of research jokes here. So I have a picture here that was taken. Has anybody seen this, by the way? I always like to know if somebody knows the punchline before I get there. So this is a picture that was taken in 2005 when Pope Benedict became the Pope. He's the penultimate Pope. And this picture is taken from the press booth. And we have sort of a social experiment here. We have a picture of people, and we know something about the demographic, who goes to an event like this. There's religious people. These are probably religious people. There's some tourists here that just happen to be in town. There's going to be people in here from the media. These are probably security people. They're kind of all dressed the same, and they're looking in different directions. There's somebody who looks kind of suspiciously back at the camera. And there's one flip phone, one single flip phone. So if I think about the adoption of technology here, this is 2005. We're not talking about like a million years ago. There's one flip phone. Now, I just happen to have another photo taken when the next Pope became Pope. And the biggest problem with doing qualitative research is that whole convenience sample thing, that people can opt out, right? But if I can observe the same frame and the same kind of people tend to go, I can control for that to some extent, and these things happened reasonably close, within 7 years, so there's no reason to expect that frame to have changed dramatically. So I can reach a valid conclusion by comparing this one analytical frame to the next one. It is a supportable observation. And remember, I'm looking at adoption of digital technology. One flip phone, 7 years later, holy moly. Now, everybody's got a phone. There's an annoying person with an iPad. There's, like everybody's taking pictures and they're tweeting and putting it on Instagram, which I still don't know what that is. And there's, there's all this stuff going on, right? And we can then start to do more studies now because we've got this. Imagine I had all these photos that were taken in this instant. The Pope's foot walks, comes out, right? You see white, right? He comes out and everyone takes a picture. And I've got all of those pictures in that instant. Now, I can compare the pixel density, right? I can see who's got the fancy cameras and who's got the non-fancy cameras. There's metadata attached to those photos. I can see who took a picture with a digital camera, who took a picture with their phone. So that's the primary observations. I can just look at the data. Secondary observations, I can look on the internet and I can see the networks of all of those people and which photos had legs and got copied to other people, which photos wound up in different places. Did those photos wind up with people who are using words about religion that are also positive in sentiment or negative in sentiment? I can look at the photos themselves and see who zoomed in on the Pope and who zoomed out on the crowd. I can look at lots of different things and I can make secondary and tertiary and ternary observations from looking at that data. And in fact, the data bubble persists even to today because I just used it and put it up here and he's recording it digitally back there, right? So, you know, this is the world that we're living in right now where everything persists and everything, we are all creating a sea of data while we're sitting here, despite our best attempts. Even if you have all that stuff turned off on your phone, location services and all the other things that could save your life if you're in the bottom of a pit, by the way. True story, there were two girls in Adelaide, 14-year-old girls, fell into an open well. And they were okay, but they were stuck in the bottom of a well. So they updated their Facebook status to say they were stuck in the bottom of a well. It didn't occur to them to use their phone to call for help. All right. And ironically, here's my computer trying to back itself up. All right. So, does anybody know what a red queen problem is? This is a computer science term. It's great. This is so cool. So a red queen problem is, it comes from Alice in Wonderland. And you know, Alice in Wonderland was written by a guy who was a priest and a mathematician, and he was all these things, right? And he happened to write this story. And in the scene with the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, Alice is talking to the Red Queen. And she says, this is the strangest place. I've been running and running and running as fast as I can, and I don't seem to be getting anywhere. And the Red Queen says, that's exactly the kind of place this is. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay where you are. And so a Red Queen problem in computer science is something which, when you turn the crank harder, when you work harder, you don't necessarily guarantee that you'll make any progress against the problem. And the most important thing about Red Queen problems is realizing that you're in one. The second most important thing is realizing that the way you get out of a Red Queen problem is to do something completely different. So think about, you're in quicksand, right? You're struggling, right? What happens if you struggle harder in quicksand? The orchestra plays faster and you sink faster, right? And the way you get out is, you know, Lassie goes and get the guy with the stick and, you know, you do something different, right? You do something orthogonally different to what you've been doing. And so one of the things that we have to do is realize where the Red Queen problems are in this big data world, right? So you may think of the data that we produce as a thing that you consume that's in a database that's available to people who are using the library, and that's absolutely true. But the world around that data is changing so fast that for us to get it right and to make it true and to make sure it remains relevant is this Red Queen problem. So you don't necessarily see it when you consume the data, but we have to think very deeply about it when we curate the data, or that data that you're producing and using is irrelevant, or at least not partially true. So these are the four forces that people generally talk about when they talk about disruptive technologies. If you want to be cool, when you go to a party and people are talking about technology, just make sure you say each of these words once and you'll be in the cool club, right? Mobile, social, cloud, analytics. If you just say those four words, you're smart, right? Mobile, social, cloud, analytics. Everybody say it with me. Mobile, social, cloud, analytics. You're now all experts in disruptive technology. Let's talk about what we mean by disruptive technology. What do you think I mean? Well, yeah, it disrupts me because it doesn't work. That's actually a really good, I'm going to quote you, okay? I need to see your name because I'm going to quote you. All right. Yeah. It's technology that doesn't work, right?
I think of it as coming in and completely revolutionizing the marketplace.
Okay.
For example, Uber and taxis.
There you go. My definition is consistent with yours, and there's no right or wrong here, right? It's something that you have to change, or at least consider changing your behavior. It's not something that you may or may not, right? So this is a laser pointer, right? I can use it to point across the room, but it's really just a long stick. I could walk over there and point. I can amuse the cat with it, but it's not, this doesn't force me to change my behavior. Uber, if I own a taxi cab company, or I own a hotel, or I own a travel site, makes me rethink what services am I offering how is that going to disrupt the services that I offer? What maybe contingent opportunities are lying underneath the surface that we forgot to think about? I had a great conversation with actually one of the senior people from Uber one time. And I said, you know, people ask me all the time, what if you could make a deal with Uber to get some data? What data would you want? And I said, well, I've thought about that a lot. And my first reaction was, gee, if I could just get, and I know they're not going to give it to me, but if I could just get the data for every ride that says where they went from and where they went to, and I started to do the geospatial disambiguation to figure out whether those are business locations, I could now start to create dyadic relationships, two-sided relationships between business locations, and I could measure the strength of those dyadic relationships. Do you think I could do something uber cool with that? You betcha, right? And some of them wouldn't be business locations, right? Or they would be ambiguous, hard to tell. You know, it's a house. I don't know if there's a home business in there or not. So the guy says, what if you could get us to help you with one piece of that collection? And I said, well, in a perfect world, I would want the driver to push a blue button or a purple button. Well, people can't see the difference between blue and purple. A solid circle or an open circle, right? The solid circle is if it appears to be a business person, and the open circle is that if I can't tell, or if it's not. So if somebody gets in wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, and they're carrying a, you know, smelly lunch, and they're talking to somebody about, I'm going to guess that that's not business. It might be. I work with some people like that, but it's probably not, right? If it's somebody wearing a blazer and they're carrying a laptop and they're on the phone and they're arguing about something, it's probably business, right? So I just want to know where are they going from and where are they going to, and is it business? But here's the problem. If I start using that to create loose connections between business locations, and either the fraudsters or my competitors realize I'm doing that, it's so easy for them to thwart that curation process by hiring a bunch of interns to randomly go between places that have no connection to create false signals. And the driver couldn't care less which button he presses, because there's no value to him in pressing that button right. So he's going to press whichever one's closest to his thumb, right? So I've got a data collection modality that is inherently flawed. I've got a data set that was ambiguous at best to begin with, and the conclusions that I reached can be easily thwarted with almost no expense. That is not a good way to start an analytic relationship, right? So we do have to think about these disruptive technologies, and we have to think about how they might change. Mobile, you know, we carry our apps around with us, right? If I lose my phone, I can use your phone and get to my thing, and right? That's great. While we're thinking about it, all of these things are changing. So mobile, somewhere while we were sleeping, became also about the Internet of Things. Now, instead of just apps being carried around, there are things talking to other things, and those things are creating data. And those things are creating data about their conversations with each other, and sometimes they don't even tell us about that data. And some of this is good, and some of this is really scary. So there was a recent study that was done. They got people to opt in. There was, you know, informed consent and all this stuff, but people with bronchodilators, you know, the things you spray, they just had a little chip in there that had a geopositioning thing, and it knew where you pressed the button. It was anonymized. They just collected the data totally anonymously, but they had when the buttons were pressed. And they looked at places, I think that one of the places was New York City. They looked at where are the clusters of people pressing their inhaler. And I hope they vetted that against where are the clusters of people so that they kind of normalize this. What they were looking for was places where there are clusters of environmental pollution that we don't know about. That's pretty cool, right? That's really cool. The Internet of Things is a beautiful thing. We want the door to the house to unlock when the car drives in the driveway, and not when a stranger's car drives in the driveway. But then you start to think it through and you go, well, unless the stranger is a police officer and I've dialed 911, then I do want the door to open even if I don't know who the police officer is. And I probably would like my door to open if my fire alarm is going off and a fireman comes in the driveway, maybe even if anybody comes in the driveway and my fire alarm is going off, but then what if the burglar sets the house on fire to unlock the doors? It's not that simple. We have to think these things through. They're not that trivial. And there's a lot of really trivial stuff going on. So I don't want to pick on the Barbie folks, but does anybody know about the talking Barbie problem? Does anybody have kids that have Barbie dolls? Raise your hands, come on. Okay, so talking Barbie, it's not called talking Barbie, I forget exactly what it's called. Cool idea, right? A little Barbie doll, and it's like Siri. It's got a little Barbie cloud application. You push a button, and you talk to Barbie, and there's a little microphone in there, and she listens, and she's connected to what all the other kids are saying to their Barbie dolls, and there's some kind of, there's controls on it. So if you say, where do babies come from, the Barbie doesn't know. Like there's it's controlled, right? And they thought about that, and it's pretty cool. And as things happen that kids care about, Barbie seems to know about them. So a kid can ask their Barbie about something that was on TV last night or something that happened yesterday, and Barbie seems to be able to join in the conversation. Really super cool. These little Barbie dolls are connected to Wi-Fi, and they have an IP address, and they have a microphone. A bunch of bad guys figured out how to turn on the microphone, and the kids were leaving their dolls in the parents' home offices, and they were getting information and shorting stocks. They were robbing houses. People were talking about vacations around Barbie. Barbie was a little spy. Now, it's funny, but you can just imagine the conversation at Mattel. Are you kidding me? Right? We have to be smarter next time. We have to make new mistakes. And I'm going to tell you about the Barbie one in a minute. There was a classic remaking of a mistake. So these word clouds you'll see a few of them in this presentation. They're intended to sort of, sometimes people don't want to hear a voice anymore. If you get bored, you can just focus your eye here. And there's lots of stuff to think about, right? Cybersecurity, cyber terrorism. How do we know when systems are secure? Let's think about fraud, right? People try to lie to us all the time to say that they've been in business longer than they have, or that they're a real company when they're not, or that they do something that they don't do, or that they pay their bills faster than they should, than they really do, and on and on and on. And they think that this is the first time we've ever been lied to, and I can assure you that it isn't. But does anybody here have a background in physics? Ha. Anybody here like to make fun of the physics guy? I study physics, right? There's something called a quantum observation problem. It's something that changes by virtue of the fact that you've looked at it. And fraud is effectively a quantum observation problem. When you observe a fraudster committing fraud, the first thing they do is they change their behavior so they don't get caught. Mm-hmm. So why would you build a model based on all your prior observations of fraud to predict the future instances of fraud when you know, in fact, that it's going to change? You've got to get that method right. You've got to get that method right. You've got to use, in that case, some sort of a learning method, some sort of a non-regressive method, some sort of something that's going to do data sensing and data curation and discover new signals. And figure out what and we do, by the way. So this is probably in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, pre-internet. Bunch of people sitting in a subway car reading newspapers. So they're reading about events that happened in the past, and they're listening to people who are not present, because some of them have like a Walkman on or something like that. And the modern equivalent of that looks something like this. The problem here is we don't really know what's going on anymore. So part of that scientific process is to observe the world around you. I don't know what I'm seeing here, because this guy could be texting this guy about her, right? Mm-hmm. This person here could actually be in real time communicating with somebody that's not in the train. I take conference calls, video conference calls on trains all the time, right? So we don't really know what the dynamic is here. We don't know what's happening. So if we were to collect this data permissibly, we wouldn't necessarily know what conclusions to reach, because we don't even understand the operating environment anymore. And these are all metaphors for what's going on in the big data world. So we got these two sides of the seesaw. We've got the data in hand, we've got the data in hand and the data that's discoverable if we go out and get it. And this is the world I live in. There's always a decision about some new data source. I get an email a day. Have I got a data source for you, right? And I may care and I may not care. The first thing I have to do is I have to sort of vet it against what I already have. There's this concept of the dispositive threshold. The dispositive threshold in data science is the point at which you have enough data to make a decision. Now, that is a very clear definition. The point at which you have enough data to make a decision. I didn't say the point at which you have enough data to make a good decision. And so people will come in and say, is it done yet? Do you have the answer, right? And, so watch this. What's the capital of Oklahoma? That's a trick question. What's the capital of North Carolina? South Carolina. We're in South Carolina. Okay. Sorry? It doesn't matter. I'm not trying to quiz you. What's the first letter in the word the?
T.
What's the first letter in the word the?
T.
What's the first letter in the word the?
Still T.
It doesn't matter how many times I ask you, the answer's going to be T, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Okay,
How do you feel?
okay.
Pretty soon you're going to change your answer, right?
Yeah, annoying.
So, there's data at rest and there's data in motion. There's data that's constantly changing. There's data that's static. There's data that is changing by virtue of the fact that you're interrogating it, and on and on and on. Some data is too big, too dynamic. It's unstructured. The cost of being wrong is so high that we need to go after this data, right? The space shuttle uses all kinds of information. There's like 5 different systems that are independent of each other voting because they don't want to get that wrong when they take off, right? So there's different methods for different situations. But what we forget, it's very easy to think of the data in hand and the data that we can go out and get. What about the data that we're never going to be able to get? And so think about in our world, think about the covenants of a 33 limited liability partnership, and we can't tell who's really controlling that relationship. What about when 2 companies have a trade agreement with each other, but there's no equity shared? Are they linked or are they not linked? Parent, child, that kind of thing. If you knew that one company had only one other customer versus 60,000 other customers, how might you think about it differently? Do you think all of those facts are easily discoverable? Hell no. We can't go out and get that data. Maybe if we really ask them nicely and we know the combination to the vault, but probably not. So one of the things that we have to do when we're assessing this positive threshold and whether or not we can make a meaningful conclusion is we have to assess the potential impact of the data that we know is not included in the decision. And there are ways to do this, even though it's sort of like, well, what would you do with the data you don't have? Well, it's what I would do with the guy with Uber when I had that conversation, right? You kind of do a thought experiment, you work it through, you do some math. It's a little different kind of math. It's not, measures of central tendency. It's a little more complicated, but we can do it. And then we get to a conclusion. So there's all this data that we're really good at collecting, that we know about, that we understand, and then all of a sudden there's this sea of new kind of data that's coming in about relationships and social signals and unstructured data, and it's contingent upon us as members of the human race to think about that data and not to just say it's ugly and it's messy and it's hard and I don't know what to do with it, so I'll ignore it. How dare you? How dare you? So, the questions that people come to us for, we generally fall into a couple categories: total risk, total opportunity, right? And we're very good at answering these questions. We've been doing it for 174 years and change, right? We're at least good at understanding when we've seen a question like this before. We're organized in different silos according to product lines, as you might expect, but our customers don't really care about those product lines. They care about their question. And it is contingent upon us in this big data world to make sure that before we answer the question, if the answer is a bunch of data, that we understand why they're asking that question and what they're trying to prove so that we can help them and not just give them the data to go drive off a cliff, right? I have a cartoon that I often use at this point. It's a car that's driven off a cliff. And the GPS is saying, recalculating, it's not an absence of data in that situation, right? It's a little more complicated. Mark Twain said that truth is stranger than fiction because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities and truth isn't, right? Truth keeps confounding us by doing things we didn't expect it to do. We've got an entire industry called cloud computing that's making billions of dollars that we didn't even have words for 10 years ago. And the reality is, does anybody think that these servers are floating up in the clouds? Of course not. They're in places, right? And those places have laws about what data you may store and what data you may not store and what data can cross borders, and we need to think about this. We can't just say, well, it's in the cloud. It's not in the cloud. The only data that's in the cloud is the data that's in the airplanes, flying around, which is a lot of data, by the way. But that's another story. So, we have to think about this stuff. I have a friend in Germany, and I joke that when I talk to him on his cell phone, on my cell phone, I can't say his name because I've digitized his name and transported it across the border. And in Germany, that's personal information, and that's against the law. Now, I don't think they think that that's against the law, but that's what the law says. All right, don't worry, the 3 sections are not equally long. The first one is just to set the stage. Are we okay? We doing okay? Yeah. All right, good, keep going. Shut up, keep going, okay. All right, so now the next section is, all right, fine, you got my attention, but what are we actually doing about it? If all I'm doing is talking about the problem, and I'm not actually taking steps to behave differently in this world, then you should call me a hypocrite. So before you do that, let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing. And this is called finding needles in stacks of needles. We used to look for needles in haystacks. That's pretty easy. Burn the haystack. But finding a needle in a stack of needles is a little bit more difficult. All the data looks almost the same, and we're looking for one piece of it. That is a tough problem. So I look at how we're doing. This is a real model. There was a storm coming, and I looked at this weather app, and one model told me that the storm was going to safely go out to sea. Another model told me it was going to devastate Florida. Another model told me that it was going to go on vacation off the coast of the Carolinas, right? All of these models are predicting the same event with arguably the same data in different ways. And we as a human race are left to try and use our brains to figure out which one we want to believe. And what do we all do? We believe the one we want to believe. Oh, it's okay, it's going to go out there. Well, wait a minute, what about all these models that say it's going to go this way, right? And, you know, what are you going to do about that? There's some really wacky things that happen with this data. One of the, don't quote me on this because I don't have exactly the right data, but it's 90% true, and if you make me find the provenance, I will. Right after Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, there was a, predictable demand for things like lumber and, other building supplies and water and, diapers and, all the people are displaced. They need places to sleep. They need, all those things were predictable. One of the biggest demand signals that got missed was Pop-Tarts. Because it turns out that they keep well and you don't have to heat them. You can eat them cold and they're easily stored and they're easy to transport and they're pretty dense calories. And so now we know the next time there's a storm coming, make more Pop-Tarts, more trees, right? So now I look at some of the smart people that our lives depend on, right? The FBI found a bunch of terrorists communicating with each other inside trending social media topics. I did not see this one coming. I think about bad guys all the time. I didn't see this one coming. My job is to think about this, and I didn't see this coming. So what these guys were doing was they would wait until something big happened, like the Super Bowl, or whatever, and I say these guys, these people, these malfeasants, and a bunch of Utes, and what they would do is they would tweet or Instagram or whatever, they would communicate about that event that everybody else is communicating about, and then part of their message would be their secret communication. And it's brilliant because it's like going into a crowded room and whispering. Nobody can hear what you're saying because there's so much other noise in the room. You may have followed this a few months ago. They shut down about 140,000 Twitter accounts after they had spent plenty of time watching these people and learning pretty much everything they needed to know about their network. So we're not as dumb as we might seem. So yay us on that one. This one here, not so much. And I'm not picking on Watson. This could happen to anybody. It just happened to happen to them. They have this cognitive stack and this amazing capability called Watson that can ingest and curate a bunch of data and then sort of behave like a person. You probably saw it on Jeopardy, right? But that's only a small piece of what Watson can do. Well, they had Watson ingest the Urban Dictionary because they wanted it to be able to understand slang. And then Watson developed a very bad case of potty mouth, and they had to figure out how to unlearn stuff, right? And then, just recently, that one happened a while ago, and I'd like to say we're making new mistakes. Microsoft deeply sorry for racist and sexist tweets by its AI chatbot. So these AI chatbots are the latest thing. They're basically programs that mimic the behavior of people talking about stuff, but they're not people. So if you want to create buzz around something, a chatbot can create what seems to be chatter, but it's not coming from a person. So why bother tweeting? You can have your bot tweet for you.
Why would you do that? Is it just
To create buzz. Yeah, to bring your numbers up, right? Well, a bunch of bad guys, this is big business. This is very big business. This is huge business, right? But, a bunch of people, just like I said that the people could hire the interns to scam the system, right? They said, well, we'll show them. And they got a bunch of not so nice people saying not so nice things, and they said it a lot to these chatbots until the chatbots figured out that that's what people wanted to talk about. And then the chatbots ramped it up and took it to 1,000 times more chatter about these horrible things. And, it takes a while to notice, right? Because these things happen so fast. We can make mistakes so fast now. So I don't think we learned much between potty mouth and the AI chatbot incident. So what are we doing? You know, we're the scuba diver, right? Our customers come to us and they can see certain things about a business. You come to me and you say, well, I see this business, I'm interested in it, it's in Norway, I don't really know anything about it. They seem to be connected to this business in Oklahoma, they have the same name, that's all I know. Are they connected? Do they have linkage? Is it a private company, a public company? Are they paying their bills? And we can do all that, right? And then there's all this data down here that we may not be able to see, the stuff that's locked in the vault, and we have to be able to make a reasonable assumption about whether we're, you know, helping you answer your question based on what we can see. That's kind of where we are. But what has changed in what we can see? We can see a lot more than we used to. We can see signals. We can see echoes of data. We can learn a lot by what we can't see. We can often see the pattern of data created by the pattern of other data around it.